We've got former Mayor Peduto here. We're really excited about this. I think Mayor Peduto during his term, I think you were like mayor at a time when maybe like pro-housing type of reforms weren't quite as in vogue as they are now. But I do think that, like based on some of the stuff you're doing right now, you I think clearly are working on some of the same issues that we are. And so I think we wanted to start maybe by hearing about like, what are the things you're working on right now? And, why are you working on those things and why are they important?
Yeah, well, thanks, David. And I met with David for a cup of coffee about a month ago. And I really wanted to get to meet him. I've been following the work that you guys have been doing. I've been impressed with the work that you've been doing. And I've been trying to amplify through social media the things that you're actually taking on. And I know that sometimes when you enter the room and you're talking about some of these issues, there's going to be people who have a louder voice and have a different viewpoint. And I was hoping to be that person that would at least have your back during that. So when he said, would you like to come to address the group? I don't do this anymore. I'm out of the business. And my immediate answer was yes. So I'm here because of the work you're doing. The work I've been doing, I really didn't enter into it with a plan. I was more concerned about everybody in the hallway and my directors all landing, and they not only landed, they all did much better. And they're leading Pittsburgh from a different perspective now. So my goal was to take 3 months off. And it was the most stupid decision that I've ever made in my life. During the time that I was mayor, I went through a lot of personal loss while dealing with the protests and dealing with COVID and working to try to heal a community through Tree of Life and dealing with the water crisis and dealing with the financial crisis and dealing with the pension crisis. And I lost my remaining 2 brothers and my mother within a period of 5 years, but I was always so busy, I never had time. So I never really had the time to grieve. And those 3 months, I was by myself in a Pittsburgh winter, sitting in my house, watching movies till 4 a.m. and actually having the time to think about things. And it was a pretty dark place. And I immediately went to work to make money. I had this idea that, I haven't made money. I worked 27 years in government. It was now my turn. And I went to work for a developer, and I went to work for a cybersecurity firm based out of New York, based out of Tel Aviv. And it made me more miserable. So I quit both of those jobs about a year later. And I went back to work with a group that I got involved with after Tree of Life called the Strong Cities Network. I had done an article in the Atlantic for them, and I had spoken at a conference in Stockholm, and I did a little video with them that ended up getting nominated at Cannes for the Short Film Festival, and it was a finalist. And so I went to work as a senior consultant with them, and we just got funded by Department of Homeland Security and Justice Department in order to be able to create what's called a prevention academy, basically taking cities around this country, 8 at a year, and training them from moving to dealing with hate, extremism, and polarization on both sides, and working from a law enforcement approach to a public health approach. And then I've been working on both sides of the Atlantic in economic development for post-industrial regions, and also staying involved very much with environmental issues. And I started a consulting company that basically works on resilience strategy, where those 3 roads come together in post-industrial areas that may be left behind economically. The likelihood of hate, extremism, and polarization is much more likely. But in order to be able to create an economic development strategy that takes advantage of the amount of economic development that will happen over these next 20 years, is the greening of everything happens. I mean, Europe is looking at this as the greatest economic revolution of mankind. We're looking at it the same way. And instead of building electrified buses in China, we should be building them in Lordstown. And being able to pull those three issues together has become my passion. So I've had the opportunity to sort of work with a group of people that I got to know when I was mayor, a group of people that I've gotten to build out of that network, like I said, on both sides, but really concentrating in Northern Appalachia, and then working with some colleagues in Germany and the UK in some of their post-industrial areas as well. And then I'm coming to the end now of 3 years, which was one of my best decisions, of a residency at Carnegie Mellon Heinz College, where I've had the opportunity to get students directly involved in these issues and to really put together great work for different organizations that looking at best practice models, but taking advantage of CMU's quantified analysis of everything and putting the numbers behind the theories to be able to help organizations, nonprofit organizations. And even though the residency is ending, I'm already in conversations about staying there and potentially working in one of the institutes that we work very closely with during our administration. So it's a different world. I don't have to deal with potholes. I still have to deal with trolls on Twitter. It's like, I'm out. You know, you win. It's like, take a victory lap, you know? It's like, but it's a different world. It's a good world. It took a while to figure it out, and I didn't plan it out. It sort of took me along. I found that probably one of the best things to do, even though it goes against nautical knowledge, is when you're in the rapids, sometimes you pick the oars up and you see where that river takes you. And a lot of the times, the good things that you've done in your past will catch up to you, and it will help you to be in a different place. So the smartest thing I did was I got a dog. And Bertha is a 2.5-year-old English bulldog. And if you ever see me walking her, on the one side of her vest, it says Bertha. And on the other side, it has the EU flag, because she's still pissed about Brexit.
One of the things that I feel a bit of a wave of people starting to understand like what zoning is and why it matters, and also like the way that our rules have been crafted to prevent housing and to empower the people who will say no. And I know, you and I talked a little bit about, the abundance movement.
Yeah.
I guess tell me about what you're thinking about that, and like what sort of stuff you're doing with that.
Yeah, no, I'm very involved. In fact, there's a group of former mayors who are a part of the abundance movement founding members. And it's being led by the former mayor of Oakland, Libby Schaaf, who's actually on payroll with the Abundance Network. And we meet every other week. We meet tomorrow, I believe. And what we're trying to do is to build out the network throughout cities across the country. He's one of the Republican mayors who's a part of this. And it's kind of fun because we miss each other. And so we have something to do again with it. But it's really going to be the critical part, I believe, of getting those elected officials who are not a member, but share the ideals, is the grassroots effort to explaining the water's warm, come on in. So in Pittsburgh right now, and you really saw it quite a bit in this past election for mayor, you do have two definitive groups within the Democratic Party. And in fact, when you only have one party, you have no party. And what you have are like all these little clans, and who can ever amass the most clans together gets the power. It's sort of like European Parliament. And you have two distinct camps that are there, but you have a lot of quality people who don't want to plant their flag on one side or the other, that would probably want to be a part of an abundance movement. but they fear the retaliation from the other camp. And that's where this group has taken a very critical role. When you say the momentum, there is momentum because now there are people who are willing to go to a zoning board here, that are willing to show up at the planning commission, that will take time out to send an email to a council member. And if you go back 4 years ago, there weren't. I mean, we lost a really good plan for Oakland. I've worked in Oakland for all 27 of the years that I worked for the city. And you would never design Bigelow Boulevard to look like that. It is the worst. It's the worst example of suburban automobile designed hellscape that you can have. And despite not being able to walk from one side of the street to
You mean
the
the
other.
Boulevard of the Allies?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, in Oakland.
Yeah, you said Bigelow.
There's Bigelow has its moments too, but
Bigelow, maybe not in Oakland, but
yeah,
for sure.
Stay with Boulevard. So it's so wide, it needs a road diet. So the developer was willing to put in money and we were going to narrow the road. Then they were going to build a walking bridge over it so pedestrians could be safe. Then they were going to donate part of the land back so we could build a park. And we were already talking about naming it San Martino Square, where Bruno was raised in a square circle that would be there. And we were in conversations with Mark Cuban to bring back the O. We wanted to find a way to bring back the decade, and sort of like in that area, the housing that was to be developed, there was some affordable, but it was working class. The focus was the people who work in those hospitals should have the ability to walk to work. They shouldn't have to have a car or take a bus. They should be able to walk. So the developer was scaling that price to be a part of it and taking out the blight and adding in density where an area is dense. But there was fear from council that there would be activists within the community and more outside the neighborhood that would, rain down hell. And so a good plan of over $400 million worth of investment that would have beautified and added a grocery store, which the community has asked for 27 years, was shot down by a handful of people. And there was no counter. There was no pro-housing Pittsburgh. And a few council members felt that they were left out to hang. And the developer has already begun selling the land off. What Oakland will end up getting will be a lesser version of what they could have had.
Yeah. And actually, funny, like things coming together here. So the very first action that I organized, which was literally me and a couple of friends, was to speak in favor of the Oakland rezoning. It must have been in 2020 or 2021, like late 2020, maybe.
No, it was 2021 because
or 2021,
we were trying to get it done before we left, knowing that some of the people that had supported the Gainey administration pretty much were part of that group that was opposing it.
Yeah, so that was like, it was, maybe me and two other people. We spoke it was one of the community meetings when we spoke in favor of it. We were some of the only people speaking in favor of it. And that kind of led to the creation of the group now, which has 500 people.
Well, then something good came of it.
Yeah, I guess so. Right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I look at that because at that same time, this was at the height of the NIMBY movement. That's at the same time, and my election. It was all sort of came together. I often think that God said, you know what, Bill, you've done your time. I'm not going to let you go back there for 4 more years. You're going to be miserable if you survive. So, and somebody told me that after it, they said, sometimes God makes the decisions we don't have the courage to make. And I was so angry at her for saying that. And every year I'm like, she was right. But that connector project to connect Oakland to Hazelwood, over $3 billion of development to happen on 178 acres in a community that has had nothing there since the 1980s. And to be able to do it through a community-based plan that the community supported, the Hazelwood community, and again, to be shot down by a handful, an autonomous electric vehicle, would be members of the bus drivers union, and that the foundations would also contribute to doing a greening of Shenley Park by daylighting the streams in the park and dredging the lake in Shenley Park, and being able to make that part of the solution of ending the flooding in the run. And, people got upset when the foundations pulled their funding when they shut down the project that they needed to develop. And I live in Point Breeze, and I have shuttles for Bakery Square that go by my area, not down my street, but to my area. University of Pittsburgh, Chatham University, Carnegie Mellon. I'm sure there's UPMC. And that's what you have. When you have institutions, you have shuttles. Otherwise, everyone's taking their own. They're not all going to ride a bus. And you don't want them all to drive a car. Now there's not going to be a shuttle. Now there's going to be lobbying and pushing to have an exit ramp off the parkway, a massive.
I think all of us here are sympathetic to the concerns that people bring up. I think people have, for whatever reason, and I think sometimes, again, these are sympathetic reasons. Like, they're worried about more traffic in their area. They're worried about changes to the built environment. People feel a lot of pride for their neighborhood. And we saw this in really strongly here in Squirrel Hill when the Irish Center building was being proposed. And that was, to be honest, that was really the moment that kind of thrust us into some prominence, because we were really vocal about being in favor of that. And we got a lot of hate for it. And, especially from the Squirrel Hill community. The Squirrel Hill community, it seemed like, was very, very vocally against that project. But, I guess I'm curious from you, I think some of the work that we're doing, it's kind of, we're just slowly breaking down those walls, and we're slowly making progress on these things. But how do you think we should go about actually combating that sort of NIMBYism? How do you make people accept that the city is not encased in amber? The city will change, and change can be good.
Yeah. So I said it to my staff all the time, and I stole it from Michael Bloomberg. Trust in God for everything else. Show me the data. And then the rational. And you deal more with, we can't have a conversation in this town in an African-American neighborhood without it automatically being discussed as gentrification. And we look at the statistics over the past 10 years of the number of residents within our African-American communities that have moved. But nobody talks about how in the rest of the county, the African-American community is growing in the hundreds of percent. In middle income, in upper middle income neighborhoods. What you're seeing in Homewood is no different than what you saw with my grandmother's family in Homewood. It's just a different decade. People do better and they move to a nicer neighborhood. It's not that everybody is being forced out. There are a lot of people, young African Americans, who have better paying jobs, who want to live in an area with a better school and better safety, and they want to have a car. And to them, that is moving up the ladder. But you can't have a boom in their downtown. Why is Columbus, Ohio, in a different league than us today when 20 years ago we were competing with them? Why have other cities been able to create housing at the same time as maintaining the cost of rent? And you need to be able to network in order to be able to get that information. And then that dovetails back to why the abundance movement is so important. It can provide that support, and you become the messengers.
Yeah, it is kind of, well, so.
And so that's, Dan Gilman, my chief of staff, and I used to go crazy because, the discussion would be coming down. And the person yelling about why this development needs to happen is Greg Perlman. It's like, Greg, that's self-defeating. It may seem like, you're providing these numbers on what it's going to do, but it's coming from the developer.
Right.
When I used to have, and what I used to tell them was, have all those labor leaders there, but put the people behind me with collars. Well, you oppose God. It's so the thing is that's the same thing with you. I mean, if you work in the development industry, fine. But if you're working in the trades or working as an engineer or came here from California in order to be able to make Pittsburgh the tech capital, that's who needs to be heard. If you work with children, if you work in the environment, if you work, your voice needs to be as that person, not a developer saying why this has to happen.
I'm curious your thoughts on something that we've experienced a lot of. I mean, obviously, like we've kind of built our power through public engagement processes, through going to ZBA meetings, going to planning commission meetings, going to council. But I think we also all generally recognize that the public engagement process is very, very broken in that the people who participate in community meetings and who go to planning commission meetings at 1:00 on a Wednesday. And, these are people that don't necessarily look like the community. You're not getting actually like broad community engagement. You're getting engagement from very specific people. I guess I'm curious your thoughts on like how you think we could reform that process or what should be done with it. Because I think people do genuinely want to feel like they have a voice, but also the way that these processes are operated, you do end up kind of like soliciting feedback from a very specific type of person and not actually from the broad community.
Couple things with that. Number one, there needs to be some structure, and unfortunately, structure usually requires resources, and resources means money. So you don't want to ask everybody every meeting. You need to be there. You need to be there. There needs to be, we need Dave, Amy, John, and Ann. And then give them a break. If they have a full-time job and everything else, they're not going to be able to do that. So there needs to be some structure within. And then the others, I'd look at, the folks from the NIMBY world, and there's like 80 organizations and there's like 200 people, it's like they're all they're in each of these groups. Like, don't just have Pro Housing Pittsburgh, have work with the Green Building Alliance and build out your partners and be there for them. Find out when it's their big issue and show up and make that alliance real. And then you'll build your network, and your network will be able to build off of itself. Now, every revolution has a counter revolution. So at one point, they're going to break. And it's going to be some issue that's ridiculous, and one of the groups will walk away. But you'll be able to have those different moments in order to be able to build something to get some victories.
From your time as mayor, what would be like one or two things related to land use, housing, that you regret from your time? Like, were there any things that you did that you look back on and you say, oh, maybe that wasn't right? Or were there any things that you weren't able to accomplish? I know you talked about the Oakland plan.
No, the big one is the land bank. We sort of put the cart in front of the horse. So we knew that it was going to require legislative change in Harrisburg. We knew that we were going to have to get the county and the school district to take a haircut on being able to not collect 100% of the back taxes. What we did not expect is that the state would stonewall us. And it was for some developers, and not necessarily from here, but from other parts of the state, that didn't like the concept that land banks gave preference to community development organizations. And they felt that it would take food off their table. And so they were able to get to significant members in the state. Right. And it was Superintendent Hamlet, who would not take a dime off of what the school would have coming, who would not join even after meetings with myself and the county executive, saying how important it was and how in the long run we would actually have more money, not less, by redeveloping that property. And they dug their heels in until the day that I was gone. And I think if I took on those challenges before creating it, we might have had a little bit more success, because I think there would have been some apprehension or disbelief that we could actually do it. You have to remember back then, Ricky Burgess was leading just a heck of a fight against us, promising that it would never get created. And it became some very strong racial overtones as he was recruiting ministers to oppose the creation of a land bank. And so I made him the chair.
What was his position there?
Hmm?
What was his position?
He said he did not want developers coming into his community, taking property, and then gentrifying his community when they're coming from the outside. And I said, well, what types of protections would you want to see? And he said all these different things. And I said, okay, well, you're the chair. He ended up, when it was created, staying on as chairman of the board of the land bank. And the other thing that I kind of screwed up with, we gave away too much. Councilwoman Gross and a couple other members wanted control. They wanted that every sale would have to
Clarified that way?
I thought it did.
Yeah, it might have.
Yeah, I think it got changed though.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't remember when. I'm starting to lose memory of all this stuff, and I think it's a good thing. So it better be. My doctor didn't say anything about it, so I'm just not exercising that part of the brain as much.
Yeah, the idea of, I feel like one of the reasons that that's so problematic, having it come back to council every time, is because I feel like it kind of becomes this almost like council person prerogative thing, where it's like, oh, if it's my area, I get to decide who builds here. I get to decide.
Man, if you would have sat next to Darlene Harris for as many years as I did, and how many properties would come out, and she's looking at the names of who the property is going to, and we're doing line item vetoes at the table if she doesn't like who it's getting sold to. Yeah.
One of the big topics in our group over the last 6 months, and really for all of housing in Pittsburgh, has been the topic of inclusionary zoning. And the inclusionary zoning overlay went into effect during your second term. Curious, like, what are your thoughts on how that's gone, and what do you think the city ought to do now?
I support Corey's position that it should be a decision that's made at the hyper local level. And I don't believe that inclusionary zoning works as a one size fits all policy. There is not, when you're building market rate in Beltshoover, it's affordable.
Right.
It's just the developer is not going to go in there and charge $3,000 a month. They wouldn't even get the financing from the bank in order to be able to do it. So I think when you see an area that is vastly changing, there can be in an inclusionary zoning condition that is put into that neighborhood, but it should also come with an incentive for the developer to be able to build. Sometimes when you create a policy, there are provisions that happen that were never anticipated. And I think that a lot of people just believe that developers are making hand over fist in cash, and they're just being greedy. That's why they're not adding affordability into it. In some cases, that may be true, but in the vast majority, they're rolling the dice. And it's a little bit less of a risk when you're building in a neighborhood that's hot, and having that type of a provision should be considered. Likewise, it should be a part of that rational part of thinking, will this project not be built? And then there'll be no affordable, and then there'll be no housing. But that's where it gets caught up in the emotional aspect.
Yeah. One of the things, yeah, I mean, we've thought about this a lot, and it's we've done a study on inclusionary zoning. We've found that it hasn't been effective.
Yep.
in Pittsburgh. And it's not shocking, by the way. But
no, I saw the Chris Bream comment, and
what did he say?
I thought he was one that said there's other factors that have to be looked at, and I think that that's true.
Yeah.
When you look at the cost of building housing post-COVID, that's a factor. I think cost is a big one, actually. That's probably one of the key factors. And we were on a boom. I mean, in 2014 to 2022, we did over $10 billion worth of development, and that includes public development as well, and a ton of institution. But all of the housing in 2022 that was built after our administration, 100% of it was ours, that we had already done and started, 75% in 2023. And just one thing also to mention, because Rachel talked about the revenues and how there's a structural deficit, but there's also a structural deficit because you're spending $49 million more than what we had projected in our 5-year plan in the 2022 budget. And we are spending $101 million more than we spent in 2022. $101 million, and nobody's saying where to go. I mean, that is a significant increase in expenditure. And that, on top of what Rachel's talking about with the structure, our bond rating went to junk bond status. And after Alan Hertzberg lost an election for judge, he seconded my motion. He came to me and said, make the motion again, I'll second it. We brought it to the table. And then it took me almost a year to convince people. Administration has every opportunity to replicate that. And I know that there's a lot of people from my team that are talking to Corey about coming back into government, even though it means a pay cut, because they want to finish the work.
So you talked about the past of Pittsburgh and going through Act 47. And by the way, this will be my last question, and we'll go to questions from the group here. I feel like there's often like prognosticators online who I think doubt that Pittsburgh can grow again. And I think, it's kind of this like fundamentally.
It was far from it. We were still in the throes of the recession out of the economic depression. And then we started to see the early part of rebirth around 2009, 2010. During that time, my council district, which went from West Oakland all the way to East Liberty, I think like Fifth Avenue, from Bloomfield all the way to this area of Squirrel Hill and Point Breeze. And I always had to keep Point Breeze in because that's where I lived, and I didn't want to be districted out, and I didn't want to sell my house. But that area grew by 10%. It's the only area in the city that grew in 50 years. It grew by 10% while the city was the only elected official that met with Google when Google kicked the tires on Pittsburgh. And I took them to this place in Shadyside called Mardi Gras, where you could smoke, and Patsy Cline on the jukebox, and it blew their California minds. And so I don't think they believe that's why they chose Pittsburgh. But those people who moved wanted to live in the East End, and they couldn't believe how affordable it was to buy a house in Shadyside. I mean, I bought my place in Point Breeze. I'm like right by Point Breeze for $92,000 in 1998, and I can't afford to live on my street now. But the thing about it is, it was that type of crazy affordability and the historic nature of the neighborhood and the leafy area and being able to walk to work and all of these things. And it was going to the coffee shop and overhearing the person who was talking over here and hanging out at the bar and talking about how we can work together. And it created something. So go from 35,000 people approximately in less than 12 years. I always thought that the city of Pittsburgh could emulate that. Not, you're not going to get that big boom in Sheridan, but you can create housing opportunities in Sheridan in different areas, and that we could actually draw in 10,000 people. And I don't know what that number is, but there is no reason that we can't. There's much more of an appeal to live in a city than there was 20 years ago. And for most of my career, I didn't deal with this type of an urban issue. I dealt with sprawl and decline. And I look at this pro-housing movement the same way that I look at a young Bill in the 1990s working on smart growth. That was what we talked about, and it was the idea that there were 1.2 million people in Allegheny County in 1946. And there's 1.2 million people in Allegheny County today, except they live all over the place. And they have all these bridges and roads and sewer lines and water lines. And that tax base gets sucked away. That type of civic mindedness probably grew out of the Jane Jacobs model, and it probably grew into a pro-housing model. And I like to think that there is this connected thread that sort of pulls all of that together. So can this re-incentivize urban living in a way that Pittsburgh can actually grow significantly? I believe so.
All right, let's take some questions in the Pirates hat there. I'll just repeat them. Yeah.
Okay. I want to thank you, Mayor Peduto, for coming. Really appreciate it. You talked about abundance, and I've kind of looked into that. I don't know a lot about it, but it seems like it's a really good idea. It's something every city should be doing to some extent. But one thing I've thought about, and I talked to my friends about leading up to primary, and my friends and I were like trying to decide who to vote for and things like that. The one thing that I've always kind of been skeptical of is how much can a mayor really do in terms of getting housing built and things like that? Because I follow someone who's a kind of famous economist from the UK named Gilly Stevenson. He talks a lot about how when wealth inequality becomes really high, it's hard for municipalities to be able to afford things like building housing because they're kind of competing with people who are very wealthy and companies that are very wealthy. And one thing, when I've looked into abundance, I know they say when we're doing growth and inspiring growth, that can kind of provide municipalities with more money and get a natural side effect of getting more growth into a community. Do you think that the city of Pittsburgh could follow something like that without levying any taxes on like corporations and wealthy people within the city? Like we can build housing without doing that.
So first, the part you asked, what can a mayor do? People think that mayors have more power than they do, in the sense that the mayor's office has power. The mayor's chief of staff has power. The directors of the departments have power. The mayor basically steers the ship. It is not the rudder that runs the ship. And there are different ways that you can make your city more appealing. I got so much bike lash just for building. And I say to people, if my worst thing that ever is said is he's bike lane Billy, I'll wear that with pride. There was no grand jury investigations going on about building bike lanes like previous administrations. So the bike lanes weren't necessarily just about the bikes. It was the mindset of what Pittsburgh is to younger people. It was the same reason that you build the largest playground in the city in Larimer, in saying, we're going to make this neighborhood a place for kids again. There may not be that many now, but we're going to make it so that the playground's there. It's listening to young people saying, why? And when I started council, we were dead last for safety and bike. And that came from whatever the national organization is. We were like 102nd out of 102. And we wanted to change the culture. And that's why there was such a reaction, because I think some people realized, now I can't make a right-hand turn on Penn Avenue. You took that away from me. So the fact is a mayor can utilize a culture of a city that can have a direct effect on people wanting to invest in it. I had a developer from Michigan He built 3 developments. In fact, he was the one who was doing the Wood Street Y development that just fell apart. But we worked with him on 3 other projects. And he said to me, this is the first time that I've ever invested in Pittsburgh. People around the country view Pittsburgh as a closed market. And I said, what's a closed market? And he said, it's when you only deal with the local developers. And we had investors from out of the country coming in and looking at Pittsburgh. And a mayor can create that atmosphere as well. One of the most important things we did was we created a economic development strategy called P4, People, Planet, Place, Performance. And we put everything that we did through this metric. And we actually created a metric. So 2 developers come and they both want to build apartment buildings. And we look at all of these different factors and we score it. You got an 84, you got a 92. They're both asking for a state RCAP in order to $2 million to make the project happen. The money goes to the one that got the 92. It helps developers to up the scale so that it's more environmentally friendly. They're hiring labor unions. They're doing things to not allow a drop of water to enter into an already broken system. They're creating all these different things that we're asking for in order for the return of financial investment into their project. And when we did that, it not only upped that level of what was being developed, but it gave us a transparency that developers understood. It doesn't matter how many tables I buy at his fundraiser. I'm not going to get the money with a wink. And a mayor can do that too. And you create that type of an open system, and you start to see cranes in the air. And you can tell, like when you go to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the mayors that really work to create that level of transparency, and the ones that like the smoky back rooms. And that's where a mayor's role is important. The staff will get the things done. The staff will make the numbers work. The staff will get the permitting and make sure that it gets through. And the staff will make sure that there's the parking that's necessary for the workers to get on the site and all of that. But a mayor can create the environment of change.
Yeah, and I do think it's interesting answer, because I think when we look at Mayor Gainey's performance as mayor, we agree with a lot of the things that he was proposing. Obviously, we have some principled policy disagreements with him on IZ and other things. But I think one of the things that was most troubling about the way that he and his staff operated was that they were very hostile to the idea of development. Development is bad. It is a negative impact on the community. It is not providing housing for people. It's not all these positive things that we know development have. And I do think that kind of negative culture that he built around development, I've heard it from developers saying, we're not building in Pittsburgh anymore.
So
why would we build in
that's
Pittsburgh?
what happens when you're responding to a small contingency that's very active. We had $115 million in commitment from the 4 largest institutions. We had a $60 million deal with UPMC, where $40 million of it would have gone to affordable housing. And again, they wanted to follow that model of worker housing. So we were using a model based out of the University of Pennsylvania that they did with Philadelphia. And we were looking at West Oakland, the Hill, and Uptown. $40 million to be able to create affordable housing in those 3 neighborhoods. That's it. So that people could walk to Mercy, they could walk to Presby, they could, have that opportunity to be very close to whatever the other hospitals up there, and Montefiore. And so that was taken away because of a deal with one labor union. We had to deal with UPMC to work on a prenatal program that was directly out of our gender equity study that recognized that Black women had almost third world type levels of medical instances when having babies, and to work directly with McGee Research. And they were going to be doing this with the city at no cost. And that was lost because of a deal cut with one labor union. We had a deal with Carnegie Mellon for after-school programs that teach young people the opportunities to learn coding. That was lost for one labor union in a deal. And you can't govern that way. That's why activists can't be good administrators. It is that you're beholden like a NASCAR racer with all of your patches of all the groups that have one specific interest and not a general interest to the city that you're supposed to love.
John?
Why did that labor union oppose those?
They wanted the contract for the unionization at UPMC. And that will never happen because of the tactics that they have used. UPMC has made it abundantly clear that if they were to capitulate on that, it would be used as a tactic against them for everything. And we tried to create the bridge of opportunity. When we raised the minimum wage for all city employees to $15 an hour, UPMC joined us. When the fight was going on between UPMC and Highmark, Fitzgerald and I played good cop, and we tried to work between them in order to bring it together. What people didn't realize is if you had a UPMC card and you went to a Highmark hospital, your rates were much lower than if you had a Highmark card and you went to a UPMC. UPMC was actually the good guy in that. And we worked with them in order to be able to get a payment in lieu of taxes. In return, they developed $3.5 billion worth of new medical facilities within the city and employed 10,000 new jobs. I mean, it's a lot of the negative things that come out against them is coming from one group. And it's in order to be able to get that union card.
Did you in front of John, you had a question?
Yeah. So I know that you said that recently you've worked more like $500
It's a really good question because we have some of the lowest energy costs in the country and some of the highest utility bills. And it doesn't make sense until you think about our housing stock is so old. And we are either using our furnace or our air conditioning almost every single month. And so we are the test market. It's just the same way with Uber wanting to use our 19th century roads to test their, if they could do it here, they could definitely do Arizona, right? So that is the, you know, it goes hand in hand. If we want to rebuild the housing in the Hill District and all we do is just build it to whatever, the true affordability cost is, can we also lower the utility bill? We ended up building, we were working with the Department of Energy to build out a model for a city of creating micro districts for energy. So we worked with a private company and we sold what we had downtown, which was a steam facility, into cogeneration into steam and electricity. They took over the facility on the North Shore and that's now cogeneration as well. We built a new facility next to Consol Energy that now powers Duquesne University, powers Mercy Hospital. Before we got in the conversion out here in Oakland from coal to natural gas to power Oakland. And the idea was to build in Hazelwood. And then also what people didn't realize is that facility downtown goes into the strip and you get the strip. And all of a sudden you have a pretty good size of the city of Pittsburgh with duplicative energy source and a lower cost energy. So you use that to power houses in the Hill. And you utilize that in order to be able to get federal grants to weatherize these homes, not just restore them or tear them down, but to weatherize them so they need less energy. And I think that those components fit hand in hand with a holistic approach to housing. We built the first, they're producing as much energy as they're utilizing. And you can already see that it fits with one of the most environmentally friendly buildings in the world. It uses the same amount of energy as a flower, you know, and I mean that by it uses water from the rain and not just the lights and heating and cooling, but the entire building has as much of an imprint as a flower. And I think that the companies that get that will be the companies that survive in those 50 years. And that it won't be environmental regulation that will bring it. It will bring marketplace. I was in Saarland, Germany. That's the only thing I have on my, because that's how weird Pittsburgh is. It should be.
So funny.
So this little heart was from the steelworkers president in Saarland. And I was there with a group of people from the Midwest and Appalachia. And we were meeting with them at Sarstar. And it says Heart of Steel. And he was pounding his fist and he kept saying how they demand. It's like, what are you demanding? And he said, we need 3 hydrogen plants in our area. And I'm like, wow, I've never heard a steel worker say that. And he said, Mercedes-Benz, Audi, and BMW have told us if we cannot make green steel by 2035, they'll buy their steel somewhere else. And green steel means hydrogen-backed electric arc manufacturing. They're going to tear down this massive, one of the largest steel mills in Europe, and build a new one. And it will be not only hydrogen, but green hydrogen, backed by solar and wind will be the backhaul to produce the hydrogen to make the steel. And before we left Germany, they already received the first billion euros from the German government. They're also pursuing EU. So when people talk about US Steel and Nippon, they're missing the mark, because if all they do is put this investment into the facility that was built in the 1890s, Kenmore is not going to be buying their steel from there in 10 years. It needs to be done where the investment will be into an electric arc system for the Mon Valley. Otherwise, they're just going to build that down south. And those guys will have a job, but that job won't be there in 2040.
Do you think there's impetus for that? I know that like back when the IRA was still, in force, we had a little bit of that, like warm energy out here. But do you think that there's enough private sector interest in greening our area?
Not without massive subsidy, not without what that steel worker is pounding his fist. So I worked last year. I did an article about that trip in Washington Monthly when I got back. And that article was read by Ro Khanna, congressman from California. And he contacted me and I started working with his staff. And in August of last year, we introduced in Johnstown, congressman came up, the Steel Modernization Act. And we had representatives there from the United Steelworkers and the Sierra Club. And the Steel Modernization Act is very much like the CHIPS Act. It's industry-specific grants, $50 billion worth of them, that would help to convert existing or where factories used to exist. So it's place-based. So you have to invest in Johnstown. You can't go to the middle of the desert in Arizona. And that CHIPS Act is before Congress, but under this administration, may never get fulfilled. And the only reason that it would is for the political purposes of those industrial areas would be where the administration would want to win points. So we'll see. There's maybe a chance.
There's a question online.
Yeah, go ahead.
2 questions actually. So Alex asked, how do you feel if you feel that the RCO program is working as intended? If you have any questions?
Which program?
The RCO program.
How do you feel about the comp plan?
About the which
The
one?
comprehensive plan.
So the RCO program, I haven't really followed it since I've left, but it was more of a response. The worst legislation you write is in response to things. It's not being proactive, it's being reactive. But it was with new community organizations appearing weekly on Facebook. And then that group of 12 people from the neighborhood demanding that they represent the neighborhood. And so not having any foundation, not having any type of a monthly meeting, not having open elections, not having anything that would give a form to a community organization to be more legitimized and not just a reaction on Facebook. So I haven't followed the planning commission meetings at all. I haven't watched one council meeting. I don't know how it's
You're not
working.
missing anything.
Okay. Now, the thing is that I think that the intent is good. Can it be done better? I'm sure. Should that be something that's looked at in a housing strategy? Absolutely. There should be some type of a structure when somebody is appearing before an elected or appointed group of people who have to make a decision, that the legitimacy of that person's claim of representing the community is gone through some vetted process. And the other one was
The comprehensive plan.
so we had a comprehensive plan. It drives me crazy every time. This is the first time ever. It was called Forge PGH. It was, by the way, so many of the things we did have been erased from the city's website. It like doesn't exist. And one PGH, that plan that we did, it was 120 pages. It's down to like 3. And just entire parts of city history have been just eliminated, which is remarkable because that's what I yell at this current presidential administration about. The comp plan we had was a comprehensive plan for the city of Pittsburgh. It got held back during COVID because you couldn't meet with people like this. But it was still ongoing when the new administration took office. Its budget was around 600,000, not 5 million.
6 million.
6 million.
6 million.
Which I think makes it the most expensive comprehensive plan in America, even for cities like Los Angeles and New York.
Per capita by far.
But like,
By
it's
far.
not even,
It's not even close.
yeah. And I don't even know who the money's going to. I know that like big chunks are going to certain groups, but then those groups supposedly are splitting it. Yeah. And it's being spread all over the city, and there's no report coming back to council. Like there's, I think, I don't know. I mean, I talked to Corey, but when I talk to Corey, it's more about, how are you doing? How's your wife? How are your children? Did you get sleep? You know, I'm not like advising him on politics or in policy. He has a lot of good people to do that. But I really think he needs to relook at this very seriously. And the thing that should happen before Corey starts is Rachel should be doing an audit.
All right, we can take one more question and then we will end at 8:30 in the back there.
And I think there are a lot of people that want to be more involved, but they definitely know where to start. And I feel like as mayor and as like during your free time with country and on the office.
Great question. I was blessed because
Repeat it into the mic.
Repeat her question.
sorry.
The people online.
How to really engage with the community. How can people get involved in the community that makes housing an exciting thing to be a part of, and at that same time to get engaged in government and having a say with what happens in your own neighborhood. I was blessed to be, just by background, I was never, I worked out of college in politics, and I was the first person to bring a computer to a Democratic campaign in Pittsburgh, Western PA. And it was an Osborne OS2 with 2 big floppies, and it was a portable, which meant it was the size of a suitcase. I still have it. And I worked for a guy who was running for Supreme Court, and they were so impressed that I became the statewide field director. And my reward was to work for Sophie Masloff in the finance department. And I mean, I had the Rolodex, I had the buzzing fluorescent light, I had the lime green walls, and I still have the stapler. I kept it because it said City of Pittsburgh. I said, I will never, ever enter that building again. I went down to DC, worked in the Beltway, and started a political consulting firm, and started doing direct mail type of targeting. Worked for a firm down there, and I stole the ideas that they had and brought it back to Western PA. And so in 1995, I went to work for a councilman named Dan Cohen, who was out here. and I was hired to become his chief of staff. My salary was cut in half for my days of running political campaigns. And I did not know the difference between planning or zoning. I had no idea. I had no idea about local government. And my teachers were the community leaders. And they're people who I was blessed through the Shady Side Action Coalition, in the Belfield Area Citizens Association, and the East Liberty Concerned Citizens. And these were neighborhood people who took the time to understand everything you could learn about zoning, about planning, and had very deep concerns about the neighborhood that they lived in. And I tried to take that model, that Jane Jacobs again model, not the Robert Moses come in and just, but the idea of the empowerment of a community. And I worked, and if you go back and look at the original East Liberty Community Plan, my name's in there. And if you look at the Baum Center Initiative, I created that and brought the neighborhoods together, and then they created the plan. And when Shady Side, we worked, and you realize too, Shady Side doesn't really need a master plan. It needs zoning. It needs to say where buildings can be this high, where commercial can exist, and that type of a thing. But when you're working in a community like Sheridan, that is seeing people come in and taking housing and making it rental, and the community is being lost, you need a community organization that's building out its own plan and looking at the areas around Langley and building out a nice commercial district in that. And then once you have that, what you have are numbers. And once you have numbers, you have politicians' ears, because then they realize that they have to listen to you if they want to be reelected. And once you have those numbers and you can do this next step in creating a development corporation for your neighborhood, then you have the ability to have people with resources at the table, money in their pockets, willing to make that vision that you created with your neighbors that the politicians are now listening to a reality. And I've watched as that's happened. I watched as a group of young people in their 20s and 30s started buying houses in Friendship. And then they created the Friendship Development Association. And then they converted 53 old mansions that had been carved up into student housing into homes where people lived in and rented the third floor. I watched as a group of people from Shady Side who then moved to Friendship and got priced out and moved to an area that nobody was living in or nobody was moving to, called Lawrenceville. And they called themselves the Boys of Lawrenceville. We're here, we're queer, things are going to start to get pretty. That was their motto. And I saw as the craft shops started to move in, and then the coffee shops started to move in, and then a boom in Lawrenceville. But it started with a group of people. And it started with a group of people who really cared about their neighborhood. And they were willing to give their time and their attention in order to be heard. And then once they were heard, they were able to do great things. And the Pittsburgh that you now have is right off of the back of the work that they did.
And I think just like to give my experience starting this group, I mean, for me, I was on a podcast a few months ago, I guess now. And one of the questions was like, you know, what would you recommend to people out there who want to make a difference? And the first thing I could think is just go do something. Like what we did to start this group was we spoke at a community meeting. That was the first thing. It was me, two of my friends. That was it. And then we got a few more people involved. And actually all the people who were involved, those initial friends of mine who were involved, they're all gone now. Like they don't live in Pittsburgh anymore, whatever. It doesn't matter. Now we have 500 people who are involved in the organization, who are, you know, participating and speaking to counselors. And, you know, I think like one of the things that I think has been really helpful for us is also like forging those relationships with the public officials. Like, I don't know if you know who your city councilor is, but email them. You know, if you see them around, talk to them, tell them what you think. And, you know, like, I think they need to hear from us to make a difference.
Oh, definitely. So, if they're not hearing from you, they're hearing from someone else.
They're definitely hearing from someone else. Yeah, right. The staff of the counselors as well, for sure. So like that would be my suggestion, you know, if you're trying to figure out like where to start. So All right. Well, that's all we've got time for today, but thanks everybody for joining. Yeah, let's give a round of applause to
Yes,
Mayor Peduto.
very nice to see all of you. Thank you.